policy's wrong in principle because essentially these are not the government's assets to sell. Housing associations are private charitable bodies that have built their stock up over a long period of time. I take over today as chair of Peabody, which was set up 153 years ago by George Peabody. Only 40 years of that have involved public subsidy. So I think selling off private assets is an enormous issue here, but also wrong in practice as well, because I don't think it will deliver what the government is seeking, which is more homes available for people to own. In fact, I think there's a risk it goes in the wrong direction completely.
Well, why do you think that? Because the government has reassured everybody that for every house that's sold, one will be built and it will be replaced.
Well, for two reasons, really. First of all, I think it's hard to see how the numbers add up. How does the receipt from the sale of the higher value properties cover all the things it's being asked to cover? But even if you put that to one side, the rate of sale will be incredibly hard for local authorities to match in terms of new build. And we know this because on the current right to buy policy, for every 10 houses that's sold, only one is currently being built. It's also very unlikely that those houses will end up being built in the same places where the sales are taking place.
Well, yes, some have raised concerns about that the important thing is that the new houses that are built where there is demand. Do you have any reassurances that that would happen?
Well, the key thing there is you have to find the land, you have to get the permissions, and the land by definition in areas of high demand is more expensive. So I think it's a difficult policy, if not impossible policy, to deliver in terms of the replacement one for one, but certainly to do it in the areas, particularly London, where the demand is high, I think is incredibly hard.
But ultimately, do you agree with the government's ambition here? They want more people to have the chance of owning their own home. Is that not something that you support? And isn't this a way of achieving that?
I'm passionately in favour of people having the opportunity to own their own home. I own my own home, so why shouldn't other people? But the way to do that, the route to that, is to build more houses. That's what we need, is for the private sector, housing associations, government, local government, to sit round the table and say, what can we do to build more houses? Because in the end, without more house building, people are going to be shut out from ownership.
But people will say, under this plan, you get those houses being built, but you also have people who've lived in a Peabody, for example, house for many years, to be able to buy that house that they've established a life around. What's the problem with that?
Well, it's worth saying, first of all, that actually you get the opportunity to buy within 3 years of being a tenant, and it's probably only going to be available to those who've already got quite significant incomes, even with the discount. The reality is that if you look at right to buy sales for council houses, something like a third of the properties end up as private rented. So in a sense, you are selling to one group of people at the expense of future generations, and I think that's an important issue that people do recognise.
And what do you think will happen then? You're making a speech in the Lords tomorrow. How much support do you think have for your point of view, and what do you think could happen to this bill? Well,
I think it's really important that the issues are raised and addressed, but I think we should recognise that this was part of the government's manifesto. And the key thing here is to say, let's sit round the table as soon as possible with government to say, how can we address some of the concerns that people have?
And of course, you were head of the civil service while the coalition was in power. What's your gut instinct? Do you think the government ever thought that it would have to carry out this promise, this manifesto promise, and push this policy through? Or do you think that it thought that it would be watered down by some coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats or otherwise?
Well, it's hard for me to speculate on that, I have to say. I know others have said that. For me, we are where we are now. It's important to engage with government, talk to them constructively and see what can be done.
And ultimately, your answer to the housing crisis, you say build more homes. How will that be funded and how can that be achieved?
Well, I think there's a lot that can be done on that. A lot was done by the last government, by the way, and I think some very productive things. But we need to get every bit of the housing industry working to the maximum effect. And I think if you do that, it's amazing what you can achieve.
Okay.